Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that I know a lot of French learners find really tricky. Compound nouns and their gender rules.
Yes.
I mean, trying to figure out if a compound noun is masculine or feminine can feel like you're deciphering some ancient code.
Absolutely.
Especially when you're studying for something specific like the pronunciator certificate on compound nouns.
Right.
But I think you'll be surprised to learn that there's actually a lot of logic and even some fun aha moments hidden within these seemingly complex rules.
Oh, there definitely is. And once you start seeing those patterns, it's really rewarding. It becomes less about memorizing and more about truly understanding how the language works.
Okay, so let's dive right in. The pronunciator material starts us off with a question that I think a lot of people might get wrong at first.
Sure.
What is the gender of lave-vaisselle?
Okay.
The word for dishwasher.
Interesting.
Now, you might think being a machine, it would be masculine.
I see your point.
But
Yeah.
here's where things get interesting. In French, the final noun in a compound often determines the gender.
Yeah, that's a good rule of thumb.
So, lave-vaisselle, even though it's this big, clunky machine, is actually masculine because vaisselle, meaning dishes, is feminine.
It's true. The last word often holds the key.
Have you noticed that in your own studies?
I have. Yeah, it's fascinating how often the gender seems to hinge on that final word.
So in this case, we'd say le lave-vaisselle. But of course, French grammar loves to keep us on our toes.
Of course it does.
And the pronunciator material throws us a curveball with the word tire-bouchon.
What's that one again?
It means corkscrew.
Ah, I see.
Now, bouchon for cork is masculine, so shouldn't tire-bouchon follow suit?
Well, logically you would think so. But tire-bouchon is a fascinating case where history actually trumps the usual rules.
I love these little exceptions.
Me too.
It's masculine, but it's a holdover from older forms of French.
Right.
It's like a linguistic fossil,
A little window into the past.
reminding us that language is constantly evolving.
Yes, and sometimes those little quirks stick around.
And what's interesting is that these exceptions often highlight words with like a cultural significance.
Right.
Or ones that are just used so frequently that they kind of resist change.
Exactly.
So we've got this final noun rule, but we also know that history can play a role.
It can indeed.
So what other kind of compound constructions are lurking out there waiting to challenge us on that pronunciator certificate?
Oh, there are plenty more twists and turns to come. For example, compound nouns can also be formed with prepositions, verbs, and even adjectives.
Ooh, okay.
Like, how about the word après-midi for afternoon? It's always masculine, even though midi for midday is masculine as well.
Wait a minute. So it's not always about that final noun.
Sometimes other factors come into play.
So we need to consider the type of words involved too.
Exactly.
This is getting complex.
I like to think of it as adding layers to a cake. Each layer makes it richer and more delicious.
Okay, I like that analogy.
To really nail those tricky pronunciator questions, you need to consider all the different layers. We've also got Couvre-lit for bedspread, which takes its gender from lit, meaning bed, and sourd-muette, meaning deaf-mute, which becomes feminine because of muette.
Okay.
And then there's Porte-fenêtre for French window feminine because of fenêtre.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
It is.
But I'm starting to see how understanding these different constructions is just essential for forming grammatically correct sentences,
Absolutely.
especially if I want to ace that pronunciator test.
It's all about those building blocks.
But tell me, are there any easy wins when it comes to compound noun genders?
Oh, you bet. The pronunciator material highlights a whole category of compound nouns that are invariable.
Ooh, tell me more about this.
They never change their gender or number, no matter what.
That sounds like a dream come true.
A great example is faire-part for announcement. Whether you're talking about one announcement or multiple, it's always un faire-part.
Okay, that's music to my ears.
Less to memorize.
Less to memorize. But I have a feeling French grammar wouldn't be French grammar without a few more surprises up its sleeve.
Oh, you know it.
What about those cases where the gender seems to completely defy logic?
Ah, yes, those rebels that keep things interesting. The pronunciator material brings up a good one. Pèse lettre, meaning letter scale.
Okay,
Now, letter for letter is feminine,
right.
but pèse-let is masculine.
What?
It's like those tricky multiple choice questions that make you doubt everything you thought you knew.
I know exactly what you mean. So even when you think you've cracked the code, there are these exceptions lurking about.
They are there.
It makes you wonder if even the experts get stumped sometimes.
Well, language is a living, breathing thing. You know, it's constantly evolving and adapting, and these exceptions remind us that there's always more to discover.
For sure.
And sometimes those historical quirks are what make a language truly unique.
I'm starting to appreciate those quirks.
Me too.
But, we've been focusing on individual roots here. How does all this play out when we're actually using compound nouns in sentences?
Good question.
How do we show possession? Specifically, the pronunciator content asks, how would you say the cat's tree using a compound noun?
That's where things get really interesting.
All right,
We can't just rely on those usual possessive structures. Think about the example, l'arbre chat.
Okay.
Literally the tree with cat. Notice the use of a.
Right.
It's not your typical possessive like du or de la. So instead of saying l'arbre du chat, we use a to create this kind of compound structure.
That is a bit of a mind bender.
It is. And it highlights the importance of understanding the nuances of these constructions. Remember, the pronunciator certificate isn't just about rote memorization.
Right.
It's about developing a deeper understanding of how the language works.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
You got this final noun rule, but we know history can throw us a curveball.
Always keeping us on our toes.
We got prepositions, verbs, and adjectives all getting in on the compound noun action.
Yeah, it's a party.
Plus, we've got those invariable words. And the tricky use of a for possession.
It's quite a puzzle, but the beauty is there's often a logical explanation behind each rule and exception. It's like solving a puzzle. And the more pieces you find, the clearer the bigger picture becomes.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It's like we're on a treasure hunt, searching for those golden nuggets of grammatical wisdom.
That's a great way to put it. Welcome back to our deep dive into the fascinating world of French compound nouns.
Before the break, we were talking about as and how it functions so differently than those possessive structures we normally think of.
Yeah, it's really like its own thing, isn't it?
Totally. And speaking of things that are their own thing, the pronunciator material throws us another challenge.
Okay.
With chasse-neige,
Uh-huh.
the word for snowplow.
Uh-huh.
Now we know it's masculine. But how would you say a female snowplow driver?
Yeah.
In French, considering, the compound itself doesn't change gender.
That's where we get to play around with those building blocks of French a little bit.
Okay.
You would say une conductrice de chasse-neige. So we introduce a feminine noun like conductrice for driver, and then use dip to connect it to chasse-neige. So it's a subtle way of conveying gender without actually altering that compound noun itself.
That's clever. I like that. Okay, I'm ready for the next pronunciator puzzle.
Give me.
What about compound nouns formed from two verbs?
Ah, good one.
The material specifically asks about savoir-faire, which means know-how.
Right.
How do we figure out the gender there?
Well, savoir-faire is a bit of a VIP in the compound noun world.
Interesting.
It's always masculine and invariable, so it doesn't even change in the plural.
So it's like his own special category.
Exactly. You'd say un savoir-faire for one type of know-how.
Okay.
And des savoir-faire for multiple types.
Got it.
It's like a lone wolf following its own set of rules.
So some verb compounds just have their own special status.
You do.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those adjective compounds?
Oh, yeah, those are interesting.
The pronunciator content gives us the example sourd-muette, meaning deaf-mute.
Right.
Does the final adjective rule still apply in these cases?
It does. Sourd-muette is feminine because the final adjective muette is feminine. It's a good reminder that even when we're dealing with more complex constructions, that final element often holds the key.
Right, the final word tends to be the boss when it comes to gender in these compound nouns.
It really does.
But we've been talking a lot about how to determine the gender of these compounds. What about those situations where we actually need to use them?
Yeah.
In sentences.
Right.
Especially with adjectives.
Okay.
How would you say a well-trained employee in French using a compound noun?
You could say an employé bien formé.
Okay.
So employé is that masculine noun for employee. And then bien formé is the adjective phrase for well-trained.
I see.
Notice how formé agrees in gender with employé, even though it's part of that compound structure.
Ah, so even though it's a compound, we still need to pay attention to all those adjective agreement rules that make French so well French.
Exactly. It all comes back to those basic principles.
Okay, before we move on, there's one more example from the pronunciator material that's been bugging me.
All right, lay it on me.
It asks about pes letter, meaning letter scale.
Yeah.
Why is that one masculine, even though letter, meaning letter, is feminine?
It does seem to break the pattern.
I thought the final noun was supposed to be in charge.
Well, pes letter is a great example of those historical quirks that we talked about earlier. Its gender seems to defy the usual pattern, but it's just retained that masculine form over time.
I see.
It's a reminder that language isn't always perfectly consistent. And sometimes those historical exceptions add a layer of charm and intrigue.
I'm starting to think of these exceptions as little linguistic time capsules.
Me too.
It's like they're giving us a glimpse into, how French has evolved over the centuries.
Exactly. And it makes learning the language all the more interesting. Each exception has a story to tell.
I love that perspective.
Yeah.
So we've explored a whole range of compound noun constructions here, from those that follow pretty clear rules to those that break the mold. I'm starting to feel like we're getting a handle on this.
You're doing great. And remember, even when you encounter those exceptions, there's often a logical explanation behind them. The key is to just keep practicing, keep observing. And don't be afraid to ask questions.
Right.
The more you immerse yourself in the language, the more intuitive these gender rules will become.
That's encouraging to hear. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the world of French compound nouns.
I hope everyone's feeling a bit more confident about tackling those gender rules after all that practice.
Me too. And the pronunciator material keeps those challenges coming, which is great. It asks about porte-fenêtre.
Okay.
Meaning French window. How did you figure out its gender?
Well, this one actually follows our trusty final noun rule. Fenêtre, meaning window, is feminine. So porte-fenêtre takes on the feminine gender as well.
Oh, okay.
So it's la porte-fenêtre. Even when we're dealing with those more complex words, those basic principles can be surprisingly reliable.
It's comforting to know that amidst all the twists and turns, those core rules still hold strong.
They do. They do.
All right, here's another one from the pronunciator content that I found interesting.
Okay.
It asks about how possession is shown in l'arbre à chat.
Right.
Literally, the tree with cat. What's the story with in this context?
Well, is like a multi-talented actor in French grammar. It can wear many hats.
I like that.
In this case, it's not actually indicating possession in that traditional sense.
Okay.
Instead, it suggests purpose or association.
Interesting.
So, l'arbre à chat isn't literally the tree of the cat, but rather the tree for the cat, or you could even say the tree designed for a cat.
I see. So, is adding this layer of nuance to the relationship between the tree and the cat.
Exactly.
It's not just about ownership. It's about function or purpose.
Right. It's a subtle but important distinction, especially for those pronunciator questions that really test your understanding of those finer points.
For sure.
Okay. Are you ready for a real brain teaser?
Bring it on. I'm feeling confident.
All right. The pronunciator material asks about homme-grenu, which means frogman or diver.
Okay. Homme-grenu. So homme, meaning man, is masculine. Following our final noun rule, homme-grenouille should also be masculine.
You got it.
Okay, so we say l'homme-grenouille.
Exactly.
Using the masculine definite article lo. Even with these more imaginative compound nouns, those basic gender rules can still guide us.
They really can.
It's reassuring to know that even when things get creative, those foundational principles can kind of keep us grounded.
Absolutely.
But speaking of creativity, the pronunciator content throws in another interesting example.
What's that?
Bleu-gris, which means blue-gray.
Oh yeah, color compounds. How do we figure out the gender of those color compounds when they're used as adjectives?
Right.
In this case, bleu-gris would agree in gender with the noun it modifies. So for example, you'd say, une voiture bleu-gris for a blue-gray car.
Okay.
Because voiture is feminine. But you'd say, un ciel bleu-gris for a blue-gray sky. Because ciel is masculine.
Got it. So it's like a chameleon
Exactly.
adapting to its surroundings.
The gender isn't fixed. It depends on the noun it's describing.
All right, one last question from the pronunciator material that I'm curious about.
Hit me.
It asks about ouvre-boîte, which means can opener.
Classic.
Which part determines the gender, and how would you say it in a sentence?
Well, ouvre-boîte is another classic example where the final noun dictates the gender.
Okay.
Boîte, meaning can or box, is feminine. So ouvre-boîte is masculine.
Right.
You'd say l'ouvre-boîte to refer to the can opener.
So no matter how complex or creative the compound noun is, there's usually a logical explanation for its gender.
There usually is.
We just need to remember those key rules,
Yeah.
embrace those exceptions, and keep practicing.
Absolutely.
This deep dive has been incredibly helpful in preparing for that pronunciator certificate. I feel like I'm starting to see those patterns and think more like a French speaker.
That's fantastic to hear. That's the goal.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening out there, you know who's on their own French language journey. We hope this deep dive has given you a bit more confidence in tackling those tricky compound noun genders. And remember, it's all about the journey. And with each step you take, you're uncovering the beauty and complexity of this amazing language. So until next time, bon courage and keep diving deep